In 1976, a paleontologist named Trinidad Torres was crawling through a narrow passage deep inside a cave system in the Atapuerca Mountains of northern Spain. The cave was cold, dark, and almost completely inaccessible. The kind of underground labyrinth that most people would turn around and leave without a second thought. Torres didn't turn around. He kept going, squeezing through tighter and tighter passages, until he reached a vertical shaft that dropped straight down into a chamber roughly 30 meters below the surface. And at the bottom of that shaft, scattered across the floor in the mud, was something nobody had ever seen before in any cave anywhere on the planet. Human bones. Hundreds of them. Thousands of them, as it would eventually turn out, piled together in a space barely the size of a large bedroom, resting at the bottom of a hole that no living person could have survived falling into. Nobody knew what to make of it at first. The site was recorded, the discovery was reported, and then, like so many archaeological finds of that era, it sat largely untouched for years while the field slowly assembled the tools needed to actually understand what had been found. Systematic excavations at the site didn't begin until 1984, but once they did, what came out of that pit year after year, season after season, decade after decade, turned out to be one of the most extraordinary collections of ancient human fossils ever assembled in the history of science. By the time researchers had reached certain layers of sediment inside that chamber, they had pulled out more than 6,900 individual fossil fragments, representing the physical remains of at least 28 separate human individuals. When those first fossils were formally reported to the world in 1993, they represented roughly 80% of the entire known Middle Pleistocene human fossil record in existence at that time, not 80% of the fossils from that one cave. 80% of the Middle Pleistocene fossils known to science anywhere on Earth. One pit, one cave, one mountain range in the north of Spain, and inside it sat the majority of the physical evidence for what our ancestors were doing and looking like nearly 500,000 years ago. The site has a name that, once you hear it, you never really forget. The Spanish call it Cima de los Huesos. In English, that translates directly to the pit of bones, and no name in the history of paleoanthropology has ever been more accurate. But the bones are only the beginning of the story. Because what makes Cima de los Huesos genuinely one of the most scientifically disruptive sites on the planet isn't just the sheer quantity of fossils recovered there. It's what those fossils have done, over the past 40 years, to everything scientists thought they understood about where our species came from, how Neanderthals first appeared, and what the real shape of the human family tree looked like at one of its most critical and least understood moments. It's a story that starts with teeth. Teeth that are 430,000 years old. Teeth that don't quite fit the category scientists kept trying to squeeze them into. And teeth that, when researchers finally managed to extract readable genetic code from the bones they came from, produced results so unexpected, so contradictory, and so deeply strange that they touched off a scientific argument that took 3 years and an entirely different approach to DNA analysis to even begin to resolve. To understand why this site matters so much, you have to understand the problem that paleoanthropologists were dealing with before the excavations at Atapuerca started yielding significant results. The Middle Pleistocene, the geological period stretching from roughly 780,000 years ago to roughly 125,000 years ago, is a frustrating stretch of prehistory to study. It's the window during which Neanderthals almost certainly emerged as a distinct lineage. It's the window during which the population that would eventually become us was also developing somewhere, most likely in Africa. And it's the window during which Denisovans, the mysterious third branch of the human family that we now know existed, the ones identified almost entirely from a sliver of finger bone and a handful of teeth found in a Siberian cave, were also alive and ranging across Asia. All of this was happening simultaneously somewhere in populations scattered across 3 continents. And yet, for most of the 20th century, the physical fossil record from that entire 300,000-year window was heartbreakingly thin. Scattered jaw fragments here, isolated cranial pieces there, not enough connected material from any single location to tell researchers what any one group actually looked like as a population, how they varied internally, or how they connected to what came before and after them. Understanding Middle Pleistocene. Human evolution was, for most of the field's history, like trying to reconstruct a 500-piece puzzle with fewer than a dozen pieces in your hand. And then there was the pit of bones. What the researchers who began excavating Cima de los Huesos systematically from 1984 onward slowly pulled out of that shaft was not scattered, isolated fragments from different time periods and different populations. It was a single population, multiple individuals from the same group, from the same geological time horizon, preserved together in one place. 17 skulls, many of them extraordinarily complete. Pelvic bones, femurs, spinal vertebrae, hands and feet. The full skeleton of what appeared to be a single reconstructed adult, assembled from the overlapping remains of different individuals, standing as a kind of composite portrait of what these people actually looked like in the flesh. By any measure, it was the most complete window science had ever had into what a specific group of Middle Pleistocene humans actually looked like as a community. And what they looked like was deeply interesting. The fossils had prominent brow ridges, large nasal cavities, cheekbone structures, and dental features that, when researchers laid them alongside known Neanderthal anatomy, matched in striking and repeated ways. These weren't vague resemblances. The lead researcher on the site, paleontologist Juan Luis Arzuaga of the Complutense University of Madrid, cataloged a long list of what scientists call derived Neanderthal features, traits that are specific to the Neanderthal lineage rather than being general ancestral human characteristics, present in the Sima fossils, again and again across multiple individuals. His team's conclusion, when they formally published their initial analysis in 1993, was that these people belonged to a species called Homo heidelbergensis, a group believed at that time to represent the common ancestor from which both Neanderthals and modern humans had eventually descended, somewhere between 600,000 and 250,000 years ago. That classification felt reasonable for years. It had narrative coherence. It placed the Sima people at a plausible transitional moment in hominin evolution. But one thing about science is that it keeps going, even when the current answer seems satisfying. And what happened next at Cima de los Huesos over the following 2 decades slowly and then dramatically dismantled the comfortable version of events. The first major disruption arrived in 2013. By that point, ancient DNA technology had reached the stage where laboratories, and specifically the team led by Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, the same team that had already produced the first draft of the Neanderthal genome, were pushing hard at the boundaries of how old and how degraded a sample could be, and still yield readable genetic material. The bones at Cima were not frozen. They had not been sitting in Siberian permafrost, which is how most ancient DNA survives long enough to be recovered. They had been sitting in a temperate Spanish cave for over 400,000 years, which is an almost impossibly hostile environment for preserving the fragile chemical chains that make up DNA. By the standards of what ancient geneticists had managed to work with before, these fossils should have been far too old and far too warm to give anyone anything useful. A researcher named Matthias Meyer, working in Pääbo's lab, later described the Sima femur sample as the hardest he had ever worked on that still produced a result. What they eventually extracted and sequenced from a thigh bone found at the site was a mitochondrial genome, a small but complete loop of genetic material inherited only through the maternal line, representing the ancestry of a single molecular lineage rather than the full genetic picture of a person. And when they compared it to every known ancient and modern human genetic sequence available, the result was not what anyone expected. It did not match Neanderthals, not even close. Instead, the mitochondrial DNA of the Cima de los Huesos individual pointed, unmistakably, toward the Denisovans, the same mysterious population identified from a finger bone found in a cave in Siberia's Altai Mountains, thousands of kilometers to the east. The same group that, when their genome had been published in 2010, had upended the field by revealing an entirely new branch of humanity that nobody had known existed. Now here was a 430,000-year-old individual from a cave in northern Spain, with bones that looked like a proto-Neanderthal, and DNA that pointed toward a population found in Siberia. That made no geographic sense. It made no anatomical sense. And it left the field in a genuinely unusual position, not knowing what to believe. The tension was real and public. On one side, you had 30 years of painstaking physical analysis of thousands of fossils, all pointing consistently toward a Neanderthal relationship for the Cima population. On the other side, you had molecular data from what was then the oldest DNA ever successfully extracted from a non-frozen fossil, pointing somewhere else entirely. Science does not generally enjoy holding 2 contradictory things in its hands simultaneously and not being able to resolve them. And for 3 years, that is exactly the position researchers occupied. The resolution came in 2016, and it required a significantly harder technical achievement than the 2013 work had been. Mitochondrial DNA, as geneticists are careful to explain, tells only part of the story. Because it passes exclusively through the maternal line, it reflects the genetic history of just one lineage within a person. Their mother's mother's mother, going back as far as the molecule reaches. It contains no information about paternal ancestry. And because it is a single piece of the genomic puzzle, it can and sometimes does reflect ancient ancestral patterns that don't match the broader population-level story that nuclear DNA, the far larger, far more complete genetic record passed down from both parents, would tell. To get the full picture of who the Cima people really were, Meyer's team needed nuclear DNA. And extracting nuclear DNA from a 430,000-year-old non-frozen fossil was a challenge that had never been successfully accomplished before. It took 2 years of continuous technical effort. When they finally recovered enough nuclear DNA from a tooth and a leg bone from SEMA, covering only a fraction of 1% of the total genome, but enough to run meaningful comparisons, the result was unambiguous. The Cima de los Huesos people were Neanderthals. Early ones, ancestral to the Neanderthals that would later range across Europe and Western Asia, not Homo heidelbergensis as a separate shared ancestor of both humans and Neanderthals. Not an ambiguous in-between. Their nuclear genome placed them firmly and consistently inside the Neanderthal lineage. The physical evidence had been right all along. And those results, published in Nature in March of 2016, set an important date, because the Cima fossils were already identifiably Neanderthal 430,000 years ago, the split between Neanderthals and Denisovans, the point at which those two lineages went their separate evolutionary ways, had to have happened before that. The data suggested that divergence had occurred somewhere between 550,000 and 750,000 years ago, deep in a period of human prehistory that the fossil record barely touches. But this still left the original problem sitting on the table, unresolved and asking to be explained. If the nuclear DNA confirmed the Cima people were Neanderthals, why did their mitochondrial DNA point toward Denisovans? And the answer that eventually emerged from further analysis is, in its own way, more unsettling than the original mystery, because it implies something about the structure of these ancient populations that nobody had quite anticipated in those terms. The leading hypothesis is that Neanderthals, at some point after the time of the Cima population, received a wave of gene flow from Africa. Not from modern humans as we exist today, but from an earlier African population that was itself already diverging toward what would eventually become Homo sapiens. That African population is thought to have carried a different mitochondrial lineage, one that was distinct from the mitochondrial DNA the Cima people carried. When that African population interbred with Neanderthals, somewhere in the window between 430,000 and 100,000 years ago, their mitochondrial DNA gradually replaced the older Neanderthal mitochondrial lineage in the European and Western Asian Neanderthal population. The Cima fossils preserve a snapshot of Neanderthal ancestry from before that replacement happened. Their mitochondrial DNA is, in effect, an older version of what Neanderthals once carried. A version that happens to look more similar to Denisovan mitochondrial DNA because both Denisovans and the early Cima Neanderthals had retained a more ancestral mitochondrial lineage that later Neanderthals lost. And what that means, if you sit with it for a moment, is that the Neanderthals you see in textbooks, the classic European cave-dwelling Neanderthals of 40,000 years ago, were not just the descendants of populations like the Cima people. They were a hybridized version carrying mitochondrial DNA that had come in from Africa, layered onto a Neanderthal nuclear genome that was already hundreds of thousands of years in development. Even before the era of what we think of as modern human migration out of Africa, there were gene flow events reshaping these populations in ways that leave traces in the genetic record and can confuse researchers trying to reconstruct the family tree from any single piece of evidence. And there is still more to the Cima story that makes this cave one of the most genuinely strange places in the human fossil record, because the genetic mystery is fascinating enough on its own. But the physical mystery of why those 28 individuals ended up at the bottom of a 30-meter shaft in the first place has never been fully resolved. And the leading explanation for it, if correct, is one of the most remarkable things any group of ancient humans is thought to have ever done. There are no stone tools at the site, no fire, no evidence of habitation of any kind. There are no plant remains, no butchered animal bones of the type that would indicate hunting or food processing. There are carnivore fossils in the pit, cave bears, wolves, large felids, but those animals almost certainly fell in or wandered in and died naturally. The human remains, by contrast, are concentrated almost entirely within a single sedimentary level, which tells archaeologists that they were deposited over a relatively short period of time rather than accumulating gradually over thousands of years through natural processes. The age distribution of the individuals is also notable, dominated by adolescents and young adults between 11 and 20 years old, with fewer older individuals and almost no children under 10. A pattern that does not match what you would expect from a group that simply fell into a pit by accident over time. There is exactly one manufactured object associated with the entire assemblage. It was discovered in 1998, and researchers nicknamed it Excalibur, a beautifully crafted hand axe made from a distinctive reddish-purple quartzite, a type of stone not found anywhere in the immediate vicinity of the Atapuerca site. Someone had to have carried it there from a distance. It was found near the human bones. And unlike the carnivore remains scattered through multiple sediment layers, it was found in the same discrete level as the human fossils. The current working hypothesis among most researchers who have studied the site closely is that the Cima de los Huesos was a deliberate mortuary site, a place where members of this population brought their dead more than 400,000 years ago and lowered or dropped them down a vertical shaft as some form of funerary practice. If that interpretation is correct, then Cima de los Huesos represents the earliest known evidence of deliberate disposal of the dead in the entire human fossil record, predating the earliest known Neanderthal burials by something in the region of 300,000 years. A single reddish hand axe, possibly carried for kilometers, possibly placed with the dead as some kind of offering. The careful deposition of body after body in a chamber no one living could easily reach. If this was symbolic behavior, if these people understood death as something that warranted a deliberate, structured response, then the roots of that capacity go back far deeper into our lineage than anyone was willing to claim before Cima de los Huesos gave us the evidence to consider it seriously. There is one more skull from the pit that deserves its own moment in this story. It was catalogued as Cranium 17, and when researchers assembled its 52 fragments and looked at what they had, they found something on the front of the skull that stopped them. 2 penetrating lesions punched through the bone above the left eye. Not random fractures from a fall, not damage from an animal. 2 distinct impacts, almost certainly made by the same object, striking the same general area from the same general angle. The pattern is consistent with a deliberate attack, someone striking another person in the head twice with a blunt object. Analysis published in 2015 determined that both blows were perimortem, meaning they happened at or immediately around the time of death, and that the fractures were the likely cause of that death. The individual had been dead when their body was dropped into the shaft. Cranium 17 is now formally classified as the earliest known case of deliberate lethal interpersonal violence in the human fossil record. The oldest murder victim in history, 430,000 years old, found in a pit in northern Spain, killed by another member of a population that was itself only discovered to be Proto-Neanderthal decades after the bones were first found. And here is what makes all of this larger than just any one discovery. When the Cima DNA results set the Neanderthal-Denisovan divergence date at before 430,000 years ago, they also pushed researchers to reconsider what the divergence between the archaic human lineage and our own lineage, the ancestors of modern Homo sapiens, must have looked like in terms of timing. The genetic models, calibrated against the Cima anchor point toward a separation between the lineage leading to modern humans and the lineage leading to Neanderthals and Denisovans somewhere in the range of 550,000 to 770,000 years ago. Some researchers, working from dental evolutionary rates rather than DNA, have pushed that figure even higher, to 800,000 years ago. A separate analysis of teeth from the Cima fossils found that the similarities between the Cima dental anatomy and that of later Neanderthals were so strong, so developed, that for them to have arisen in the time available under the old divergence estimates would have required an impossibly rapid rate of dental evolution, which in turn means our family tree, that leads to us, was already diverging from the branch that leads to Neanderthals before what most textbooks still describe as the critical transitional period of human evolution. We have been a separate lineage, quietly becoming ourselves, for longer than most people who think about human prehistory casually have been led to believe. And then there is the deepest implication of all, which the Cima data helped crystallize even if it wasn't the only piece of evidence pointing in this direction. The old model of human evolution, the one where Homo heidelbergensis was a kind of middle management species that gave rise to both modern humans in Africa and Neanderthals in Europe, like branches splitting from a single trunk, is no longer viable in its original form. The Cima people were not Homo heidelbergensis on their way to becoming both us and Neanderthals. They were already Neanderthals, or at least firmly within the Neanderthal clade, at a date that forces the divergence from our own lineage back much further than that species was supposed to have lived. Homo heidelbergensis, as a coherent taxonomic category that bridges the two lineages, effectively dissolves under the pressure of what the pit of bones has revealed. The actual picture is messier, richer, and more complicated than that tidy story ever was, a web of populations diverging, interbred in multiple waves, sometimes carrying gene variants from entirely different lineages inside genomes that look straightforwardly Neanderthal on the surface, sometimes preserving ancestral mitochondrial DNA signatures that make them look like something else entirely until you dig deeper. What you have to understand is that the Atapuerca cave system is still being excavated. The research is not finished. Researchers have continued recovering new fossils, new fragments, new specimens from the Cima site, and from other chambers within the broader cave complex. New techniques for extracting and analyzing ancient proteins are allowing paleogenomicists to squeeze biological information out of fossils even when DNA has completely degraded, the same approach that identified the Denisovan jawbone from the Tibetan Plateau in 2019. And as those techniques are applied to other poorly understood Middle Pleistocene fossils sitting in museum storage around the world, fossils that were found decades ago, classified as best as researchers could manage at the time and filed away, the results are beginning to suggest that our understanding of the diversity of human populations in that critical window is still significantly incomplete. What the Pit of Bones has done across 40 years of excavation and 3 decades of increasingly sophisticated analysis is give us something rare in the study of deep prehistory, a fixed point. A place where we can see, with unusual clarity, what a specific population of ancient humans looked like physically, approximately how many of them there were, what developmental stages they passed through, and now, something meaningful about their genetic identity. And what that fixed point has revealed is that human evolution in the Middle Pleistocene was not a linear march from primitive to modern, with one species neatly succeeding another in a chain of gradual improvements. It was a branching, tangled, geographically sprawling process, shaped by repeated encounters between different populations, punctuated by gene flow from unexpected directions, and far more ancient in its critical divergences than the fossil record alone would ever have led us to guess. 30. Meters below the surface of a Spanish mountain, at the bottom of a shaft that an early Neanderthal once carried a beautiful red hand axe to the edge of, the bones of 28 people have been telling us this story for 430,000 years. We are only just now developing the tools to hear it clearly. And whatever we find next, in the next season of digging at Atapuerca, in the next protein analysis of a forgotten fossil in a museum basement, in the next attempted extraction of DNA from material that everyone assumed was too old and too warm to preserve anything readable, it is going to keep pulling the picture wider, keep pushing the dates further back, and keep making the version of human prehistory we thought we understood look simpler and tidier than the real thing has ever actually been. The teeth are 430,000 years old. The story they are telling is still not finished. What part of this surprises you the most? That Neanderthals were deliberate enough to bury their dead 300,000 years before we thought, or that a single cave in Spain holds more evidence of that lost world than almost anywhere else on Earth? Let me know in the comments.